G'day everybody, it's Ben. I'm coming to you from the Sunshine Coast of Queensland, and I wanted to show you all an article which I read throughout the week. I thought it was quite an interesting article. Let's have a look. Not this one, let me get the window open. So the name of the article is "The Atheist Who Wants More Churches in Australia." And this is on the Gospel Coalition Australian website. Now, the thing is, I'm not going to read the whole article word for word because that'll take a long time. But I would recommend you go read the article. It is absolutely phenomenal. It's amazing. It's such a good article. Now, it's about Federal Labor MP Andrew Leigh. And this guy, he's an academic, originally was an academic, and he worked with a sociologist called Robert Putnam, who did research at Harvard University, well-known, well-respected university. And he talks about the issue of social capital. And he talks about the issue of churches and how churches actually help build social capital. So social capital is the idea that the networks of trust and reciprocity that links us together have some inherent value. Economists have long recognized that physical capital like bridges, roads, and cars have value. And in the 1960s, we came to agree that human capital, the skills and education that we acquire, also have value. So things changed. And then in the beginning of the 21st century came the idea of social capital, the notion that the networks themselves matter, that societies can do better when they're better interconnected, and individuals are more likely to prosper when they have more ties to others. He then goes on to talk about how Australia is doing badly in terms of social capital, that our social capital is decreasing here in this country, and that's a very grave concern. Things like the amount of neighbours that we know, and the amount of close friends that we have, those measures have actually dropped quite a lot. I've just recently moved from Melbourne, and I can completely understand why that is, especially in big cities. It's very easy to become disconnected, and that seems to be the default when you're in a city like Melbourne, and people continue to move to capital cities. There's more and more people living in the big capital cities, although there's been a bit of an exodus away from there with COVID. But given how many people live in cities, it's still quite a big issue, and it can also happen in regional places too. That's for certain. So it's been suggested that complete social isolation can be as bad as being a chronic smoker or chronic drinker for your health. And the implications that he's talking about is that levels of social isolation, as they go up, they can be worse and worse for your health. Now, here's the thing. Churches add to the social capital of a society, is what research has shown. Now, this is coming from Robert Putnam, the guy that this Labor MP actually studied with and did his research with. Now, they talk about how that works. And, I mean, first of all, it's interesting because going to church actually makes you a nicer person. So here it is. They're more likely to donate money, even putting aside their religious giving. Churchgoers are more likely to donate blood, a fact that Robert Putnam uncovers in his terrific book, American Grace. And at the same time, those who've gone to church have been more likely to volunteer in their local communities, even putting aside their religious volunteering. So it's not just they're giving to their church and they're volunteering in their church and that counts as volunteering. It's not just that. It's that you're actually more likely to do things which are good for the community, volunteering, donating, giving your time, effort, and energy to helping others if you are a member of a church. So I love this. This is so good. I love this. This is really going to get up the nose of atheists. Putnam sums it up by saying that religious people are just nicer, but not because they're congenitally nicer, as in they weren't born nicer. They weren't nicer because they turned up at the church, but being there puts them in a milieu in which people ask them to help out and in which they become more involved in their community. I don't know if I pronounced that word right, by the way. I know what it means, I just don't know the pronunciation. My French isn't great. So that's the thing, is that if you're involved in a church, you're more likely to actually participate in things which are good for your community, to uplift your community. You're more likely to volunteer out in the wider world. Now, the other thing is, churches can help build bridges across a divided society. And this is really good. This has certainly been my experience, which I'll talk about in a minute. People who attend church are more likely to know someone who's on welfare, and more likely to know a CEO. Churches in Australia have done a terrific job of cross-cutting class differences. They're effective in bringing together people who otherwise would not rub shoulders in the streets. Okay. So there's two types of social capital, bridging and bonding. And bonding is just kind of, rubbing shoulders with and building connections with people who are like you. But bridging is to spend time with someone who is different to you. Churches can be very effective in that bridging social capital sense. And yeah, that's very interesting because it certainly backs up my experience. And he goes on to talk about how churches help reduce the polarization of Australian society, which might be something that, people who are critical of churches may hate to hear, but this is what the research is showing. Yes. So what I wanted to do, I just wanted to take a bit of time to talk about my experience. So I grew up in church. I went to a Baptist school. I was involved in the Pentecostal church for all of my childhood and teenage years. And definitely that involved interacting with people who were very different to myself. There was a lot of ex-drug addicts. There was a lot of people who were from very rough backgrounds, ex-prisoners, that sort of thing. So I spent time with people who I otherwise wouldn't have spent time with. But at the same time, there was a lot of Filipinos, there was a lot of Pacific Islanders as well. Our denomination actually established itself in the Pacific Islands. And so when people would emigrate from the Pacific Islands to Australia, they were much more likely to come to our church because, well, that was the denomination they were familiar with. So there was certainly this experience for me of being around people who I ordinarily wouldn't have interacted with. And it definitely broadened my perspective on things. So that's the important thing, is that church can bridge gaps. And as the article just pointed out, we are polarized right now. There are seemingly intractable differences that people have, and it's very hard to kind of build those connections. So now I can definitely see that there's going to be objections raised to this idea that, churches are so good. And by the way, in the article, the guy being interviewed, the Labor MP, he said he wanted more churches in Australia. Well, I can bet that secular people will be like, why does it have to be a church? Why can't it be a secular organization? Well, let me just speak into that, because I've been involved in non-church organizations and meetup groups, and I've also tried to organize meetup groups. And I just have to say, good luck with that. Good luck with that. If you want it to be a non-church organization or group and you want to get commitment from people, good luck, because you will absolutely need it. The thing is that from my experience, people don't want to commit to things. The general default among the population is to be flaky, is to not commit to things, is to say, yes, I'll come to that, but if I get a better offer, I'll drop that offer and I'll go do something else. That is what almost always happens. So I want to point out as well that you need a very powerful motivator to get people to commit to coming to something on a regular basis. You need something super compelling to get people to commit. And in my experience, anything of a secular nature tends to not be very compelling, except for maybe work. I mean, if you're paying someone money, they'll usually turn up. But failing that, people will tend to be flaky. Now, by contrast with church, there's the understanding that what we're doing by meeting together with other Christians has eternal implications. It's something that for all of eternity will make a difference. There's also the understanding that we're going to be spending all of eternity with these people. So we may as well build deep relationships now because they're going to be continued on forever. So that gives a very compelling reason to meet together. And I've found that, with churches, it's often easier to get commitment from people than it is with secular groups. But having said that, it's still very difficult to get commitment with people in church. I mean, the general culture today is one of flakiness, as I said, and that does filter through to church, unfortunately. But it is much more likely that someone will turn up on a regular basis to a church than to a secular organization. So another objection I can already guess at that people are going to raise is they're going to say, oh, we don't want more churches because aren't churches sexist and homophobic? And, they have this harsh, literal interpretation of the Bible. That's not good. We don't want more of that. Well, here's the thing, right? The churches who tend to compromise on these things are dying. And let me just demonstrate. Let me just show this article. This is really good. This shows it really well. So the church denomination that is the most liberal in Australia is the Uniting Church. And interestingly enough, Uniting Church people are finding that their churches are dying. So look at this. These are some quick stats. Attendance in the Uniting Church is down 40%. And you look at how attendance has gone down from 1991, 1996, 2001, 2013, and it'd be worse now. I mean, we're in 2021 now. It's no better than this. Actual number of congregations operational has gone down 31%. It's not good. And here this article's talking about decision time for Uniting Australia, for Uniting Church in Australia. And this is back in 2017. And it does talk about how the Uniting Church has kind of 4 options. And one of them is basically the church is wound up and its assets dispersed. Because it's just so... It's really bad what's happening there in terms of how the church is just hemorrhaging members. People are leaving, not coming back, and it just doesn't have the energy to keep going, or the energy to they're shrinking. They're not growing, they're shrinking. So this is a church with the most liberal interpretation of scripture. That's a major denomination. And we can see that they're not succeeding. So the idea that, why don't we start more liberal churches? Wouldn't that be good for the community? Well, people just don't go to them, or people are leaving them and not coming back. It's the churches that have stuck to a more faithful interpretation to the scriptures, who, adhere to a more conservative interpretation of scripture, that are in fact growing. So let me pull this up for you. I grew up in the Pentecostal church, but here's the thing. Pentecostal churches are actually growing. And they're one of the only church groups, denominations that's actually growing. I mean, they're the second largest single denomination in Australia at the moment. And obviously Catholics are the first. So here's the thing. 1991, we were right down here, number 5. 2016, we're here too. And you can see Uniting went from 3rd down to 5th. So there's been a significant change. So that's pretty much all I have to say on the matter. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you have a great weekend and week and whatever else it is you're doing. Thank you. Bye.